So this is completely constructed out of primitive objects, and this is going to be an exercise to help us get familiar with moving things around, scaling things, grouping things, creating primitive objects, fairly basic stuff for day one. All right. So I'm going to close things so that my interface is a little more looking like yours, hopefully. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a cylinder. And we're going to click on the cylinder in the shelf and over in the channel box. And again, if you don't see the channel box, you can click on this button in the top right, or hopefully you've got a tab here that says channel box. And with the cylinder selected, we can click on the polycylinder 1 input. Again, this is the creation settings. And let's give it a height of 20. So I'm going to hit 20, and then I'm going to hit return on the regular keyboard so that my focus leaves the channel box. If I wanted to try out a few different things, if I wanted to say 10, I could hit return or enter on the numpad and try out a few different things quickly. But I know that 20 is what I want, so I'm going to hit return, and I've got a long cylinder. And I'm going to name that by clicking in the channel box, and I'm going to call it column main. So this is going to form, where's my, there we go, the columns. Okay, I'm going to create another cylinder, but this time I'm going to use the hot box. So I'm going to hold down space bar, hold it down, and click create polygon primitives cylinder options. This time I'm going to hit the options. Okay, click on that and then release the spacebar. And I'm going to hit edit reset settings just to make sure everything's back to original settings. And I'm going to do a radius of 1.5 and a height of 1. And that's it. I'm going to hit create. And so now we've got another cylinder that's at the origin. So this time, if I look around, I want to move this up to the top, and I'm going to hit W to get the move. And I'm just going to bring it up, and sort of by eye, I'm going to take a look at this, put this on top. You can go into 4, or hit 4 to go into wireframe mode, and then you can kind of see if they're intersecting a little bit. I just want them to have a little bit of intersection. So they're not floating, so there's no gap, but pretty close. You could snap it exactly, but for this, we're just going to eyeball it. I'm going to hit 5 to go back into shaded mode. All right, now I'm going to use the marking menu to create a cube. So I'm going to hold down Shift, right mouse button, and go down to Polycube. Now, if you see a different marking menu and you're thinking, what's going on? That's because you've got the cylinder selected. So this is like a context menu. It is context dependent. So deselect everything, and then Shift, right mouse button to get the creation menu. So we got Polycube. Okay, now we can't see it, but it's in there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale this just by eye. I'm going to hit R to go to the scale tool. And we're going to scale this up. I tend to switch back and forth between wireframe and shaded mode a lot, just because they show you different kinds of information. So I'm going to move this down to the bottom and scale it kind of flat. Again, we kind of want this sort of thing at the bottom. Maybe a little bit more. And we want another one at the top. So I'm going to hit Command D to duplicate it. And you're not going to see any change, but over here you should see P cube 2. And I'm going to hit W to get the move tool. And again, I'm going to just put it close to the top. If you don't like the scale of them, you can shift select both of them, and then when you scale them, they scale sort of independently. Or the scale for both of them is changing to the same amount, but this one is being scaled with its own internal pivot point, if that makes sense. All right, so we haven't been renaming these things, all of them, so I'm going to hit Command-Shift-O to open up the outliner, or I can go to Windows Outliner. If you didn't, that's a hotkey that I added in the previous section, so if you don't have that hotkey, you can just go to the window outliner. All right, so this one I'm going to double click and call this column cap A. This one I'm going to call column base. And the last one I'm going to call column cap B. Okay, so now we're going to select everything. Just marquee select around them all, or you could select them in the outliner and Command G to group them. And here's our column. So I'm going to call this column group, GRP. And again, if you remember that if you select it in the viewport, you're not selecting the whole column. So you want to hit up on the keyboard to pick walk up to the group, or you can select the group in the outliner. You can do both things. All right. So now I want the column to be sitting exactly on the floor. And a fairly simple way to do that, there are other ways to do it, but a fairly simple way is to change the pivot point. So I'm going to hit W to get the move manipulator. I'm going to hold down D and I'm going to click on this bottom face. So you should get the align key, or the align sort of text. And I release D and I've got that pivot point for the column sitting at the bottom of this cube. So again, that was holding down D and then I'm clicking on the bottom face. And now I'm going to hold down X to snap to the grid, and I'm just going to click and drag on the axis to make it go up. And you can look and make sure that it's been snapped to the right point, the origin there. We can hit spacebar to go into the other views, and that might be an easier way to see whether it's snapped. So you can hold down X and snap to the grid. So we've got one column created successfully. And we want to make a bunch of them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to translate this one 20 in the Z. So I'm just going to go to translate Z and put 20, and that's going to slide it over. Now I'm going to hit Command Shift D, and if you reset the settings, that should pull up the duplicate special. If you didn't set that hotkey, then so if you didn't set the hotkey, that's just going to duplicate special with your previous settings, and so that's going to be clear, make it fairly obvious why it's always good to open up the settings. So I'm going to reset the duplicate special options. If you don't have that hotkey set up, again, you can go Edit, Duplicate Special, and click the Options box. Okay, so with reset settings, what am I going to do? I'm going to put in a value of -8 for translate Z. So -8 here. And I'm going to make 5 copies. And that creates a nice group. You can think about the math I did. That wasn't arbitrary. Those values were chosen for a reason. So you can think about that. But that should match our columns out here. Yeah? You hit apply and then you hit Command Z. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know of an easy way to preview that. Okay, so we've got our columns and we're going to group them all with, again, selecting all the groups and Command G. And we're going to call this columns, plural, group. And I've misspelled columns. And that's just to keep our scene hierarchy tidy. All right, so now let's create some steps and a roof. So again, with the marking menu, Shift right mouse button, I'm going to create a polycube. That's going to create a tiny little cube at the origin, and I'm going to change some of these inputs. So the width is going to be 10. I'm going to hit Tab to advance to the next field. The height, 1, that's fine. Tab to advance to the next field, and then a depth of 48. And you can see as I'm tabbing through these that it's making changes in the viewport. Okay, so now I'm going to duplicate this with Command D. And you can see that these, again, those inputs disappeared. So we've got our second P cube too. And I'm going to put the Y to -1. So that's just going to drop it a whole unit down below it. So they should be exactly stacked on each other. And again, I forgot to name these, so we're going to call this one step. And Maya cannot have objects named the same thing. So if I type step for this one and hit enter, it's going to add a number at the end of it. So that's an important thing. Maya is all about naming, and it can't have conflicts. So if it detects a conflict, then it's going to add numbers to the end of it. All right, so we're going to hit Command D one more time. And then we could put -2 in the translate Y channel box to drop it down 1, but I'm going to do something a little bit tricky. I'm going to use a bit of math. It's not difficult math, but you can actually do a little bit of math in the channel box. So I'm going to do minus equals 1. And what that means is that subtracts 1 from the current value. Now, as again I said, that's not difficult math, but that's just to show you that you can do math in here. So for example, I could do times equals 4.2, and then that would multiply the value, which was -2, by 4.2. So I'll hit undo. Again, so like adding, you could do plus equals 11, and then that's going to bump it up 11. So a little bit of math in the channel box can be handy in many situations. So we've got 3 cubes here, but they don't look like steps yet. So I'm going to hit space to jump into our 4 view. And in this, I'm going to hit put my mouse over the front view and hit space again. And now we get a full view of the front. I guess it's the side of the of the building that we're creating, but that's what it's called, the front view. So I'm going to marquee select the 3 steps, or I could do that in the outliner. And I'm going to move the pivot point to the back of the steps by holding down D and X and dragging the arrow to the back and then releasing. And now I've got the pivot point at the back of the steps. So I'll do that one more time. So I had all 3 objects selected, holding down D, holding down X, and then clicking and dragging to snap to the grid. Again, we're snapping to the grid, and it's snapping right to the back of these cubes. So if you select them individually, you should see the pivot point at the back. All right, so the top step is fine. The middle step we want to scale out. So I'm going to scale out the X 1.1. And because, again, with a bit of math, and because we had the pivot point at the back, we're scaling this out to a total of 11 units width. So this one we want to scale out to a value of 1.2. And that's scaling it out because we've got the pivot point at the back. That's scaling it out to 12 total units. So now we've got some nice even steps. Something that you'll find in Maya over and over is that there's hundreds of ways, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there's hundreds of ways to achieve the same thing. And most of them are perfectly normal or perfectly adequate for the job at hand. So just because I did something one way doesn't mean you have to do it exactly the same way. And they'll serve different purposes. So I've got, although in many instances you will achieve the same end result. So I'm going to select all the steps and just move them over a bit so that the back is closer here. And because they're all selected, I'm going to hit Command G and group them. Step group. All right, so let's spacebar and spacebar to get back to our perspective view. And we're getting pretty close. So again, with the marquee menu, I'm going to create a prism, which is down here in this lower section of the marquee menu. Now, don't be afraid to they're just pixels, so you can get up all in their business. So hit F to frame in on it. And that means that you're going to be tumbling around whatever object is selected. So if you're way back here and you're trying to move things around and it's really hard to see, don't do that. Get close. And we're going to move this up to the top. Again, we're doing this by eye, but you could use precise values if you are wanting to be more specific. And we're going to rotate this way, but I'm not going to do it freehand because that's not going to be accurate. So I'm going to use the step snap. And if you haven't set the step snap to 45, I recommend that's a good thing to do. So if you click on the arrow up here, you can click on the tool settings. Another way to get the tool settings, incidentally, is to double click on this toolbox here. You can get the move settings and double click on the rotate settings. So we've got our rotate settings up, and we're going to set the step snap to relative, change that to 45, and set that back off. So now in the viewport, we can hold down J, and when we hold down J, we notice that the step snap becomes active. And 1, 2, click, and we're perfectly at 90 degrees. Some of you might be clever enough to note that it would be equally as quick to just type 90 into the rotate. But you don't often know which axis you're going for, so sometimes you go, which axis am I rotating? Oh yeah, Z, and then you just hit 90, and that's another way to do it. And let's just scale this thing out till it looks how we want it to. Give it as much slope as you think works. You can move it down a little bit so it sits on top, but not so much that you get edges poking out. It's okay for objects to overlap, but when they're interpenetrating like that, obviously that's not a desired result. I'm going to scale this out just a little bit more. I'm going to call this roof. I'm going to select everything, group it one final time, and call this Greek temple group. There we go. And that about brings us to the end. So we could take the whole group, and if we wanted, again, if we wanted this sitting on the grid on the floor instead of sitting below it, that might be important for your scene. So I'm going to hit D and click on the bottom, hold X, and snap it to the grid. And there we go.